Let me start, David, by asking, let's talk for a moment about Miami, which is not typical Chipperfield territory, we could say. But I know that you're now embarking on a large mixed-use project that has not been formally announced, but we can slip in a word or two that it exists. What do you make of this place? You know, so much of your work has been about connecting new to old and responding to context. What does old mean here? What does new mean here? What does the context mean here? What do you make of Miami and Miami Beach? We might as well start with a narrow question. Simple question.
You're putting me onto the...
I think you need to switch it on, perhaps? Is it? Okay.
You're putting me on the spot. What do I make of my... Well, I think, first of all, you're introducing this by the idea of history or, historical context. And, of course, Miami's historical context is slightly thinner than maybe a European one, although it has... you can't deny that there is a strong cultural and physical context. And I think in terms of our own work and my work, it is true that a lot of the projects have been in historical or complex European historical circumstances. But all that means is that as well as the conventional context of program, place, topography, you have another one, which is history.
Yeah.
And context, rich context, is, let's say, easier to play with, or there's more, there's more coming back across the net. You hit the ball and there's a lot of stuff coming back. I mean, if you're working in an industrial area outside of any city, there's not much stuff coming back. So in terms of design, you want that pushback somehow. You want to look for energy and oxygen from the task. So it's not dependent on history, because there are plenty of others. So, we're working on a project in the Design District.
Yes.
And I think that that's a really interesting context, because there has been grown out of a pre-existing fabric in a rather, let's say, organic way. There's been a sort of an intelligent reuse of buildings and exploitation of buildings in a rather agile way, and I think that's quite interesting. Clearly, the design center has got to a certain status now. I mean, it's no longer a sort of intervention thing. It's got its own scale and its own seriousness. And I think it's very interesting now to be doing a project there, which is in a way a sort of next layer of seriousness.
Yes.
In an area which before was quite unself-conscious in a certain way.
You were very much so, I think, yes. I think that puts it very well. And it was really just, some found buildings that were, and in fact, their initial appeal was that they were sort of almost off the radar.
Yeah.
And now one can certainly not say that about the Design District anymore.
It was a cuckoo nest.
Right.
So the cuckoo nest is always a comfortable position, because the buildings which are there create the character.
Yes.
So our task, which I think is a really interesting one, is to say, how do you add, outside of the cuckoo nest, something which is drawing from it, is not underestimating it, but in a way maybe giving another dimension to it, or maybe pushing it to another, to its next phase, or being part of an evolution.
Which is a fascinating design challenge, I would think, actually, because part of its appeal, I think, always has been that the design district is not, it's not a mall, it's not a bunch of high-rises, it's not the kind of convention, it's very unconventionality has been a big part of its appeal. So as you add a large project and bring it to another scale, I would think that a lot of the challenge is not allowing it to be more conventional and not to lose that quality.
Yes, but you can't still draw on the same qualities. You can't use the same aesthetics. I mean, in a way, it's not. I mean, I worked for 20 years in Berlin, and after the wall fell in Berlin, everything was improvised.
Yes.
And Berlin got its identity over this last 20 or 30 years from being, a teenager, or an adolescent.
Very much so.
An adolescent.
Yeah.
It's struggling now to grow up. It doesn't quite know how to be a mature city. It's trying to find that. And in a sense, I would say the design district is not struggling with its adolescence, but it gets to a certain scale where I think the challenge is exactly what you're saying. How can we add to it without smothering or not misunderstanding its qualities? But we do have to, I think we will be adding a bit more, in a way, social infrastructure or urban infrastructure, because it is a larger scale intervention as opposed to a sort of piecemeal.
Right, and yet neither can you parody what's there now, of course. I think you touched on that a moment ago. I mean, the buildings being both new and at a different scale, they can't just be what's there now. It can't just be an extension of that, because it can't, you don't want to make a Disney World version of the design district.
But I think if I take your question in a sort of larger way, how do you get design inspiration, or how do you find relevance? I think that as a designer, you are a sort of service in a way. You're commissioned to do something, but the thing you're commissioned to do is pretty straightforward. Let's say, you design an office building, or you design a housing project. But I mean, in a sense, that's not the task is quite simple. It's what you make out of the task, and how you define the task, and how you try to make that task more relevant. So in every project, one tries to look for the relevant ideas. So where could you find relevance in this? And I grew up, I graduated architecture school in the 19th century somewhere, in 1980, early 1980s. And there was a recession, and as you well remember, there was a sort of collapse of modernism, a loss of confidence in the modern program.
I do remember that, having also grown up in the 19th century, yes.
So although we'd been taught by a generation that was very infused by a sense of responsibility, they were a generation that were building housing projects, post-war housing projects, universities, social infrastructure. So we were taught by people that thought being an architect meant building society.
Right.
And we came out of architecture school, and Margaret Thatcher had, in a way, dismantled the idea of the state, and the economy was in a big recession. So my generation, in a way, came out with without mandate. We had we inherited a notion that we might make the world better, but when we came out, no one trusted us to make the world better, and there were not explicit opportunities that there had been for the generation before us,
Right.
who had been given universities, theaters, and museums. So I would say my generation had to be much more nimble-footed. You know, we had to find. I don't mean find work in a way of sort of like looking for food, but in a way, sort of the route to be an architect was not very clearly set out. And in fact, my first projects were in Japan. I mean, the first. So. But I think it taught me always to take every task seriously, and to take the task seriously by trying to find relevance in the task. And that means you have to decide what this project could be about. Mm-hmm. How could you make it more than what it is? In a way, how can you exaggerate its importance?
You've anticipated my next question quite brilliantly, but because I wanted to talk about that very evolution that I think the profession is experiencing now, certainly in this country and also in Europe, toward trying to reclaim some of that social mission that it once had. You're right that it had diminished and become very questioned by the 80s and 90s, but it was also, I think we could say, a little bit shaky before that too, as modernism became less a sort of utopian project as it had begun as, and more just an aesthetic statement or a collection of aesthetic statements. How do you see this evolving now? I mean, the growing sense of social responsibility. What can an architect do beyond conscientiously building what his or her clients want? What else can an architect do to make society better?
Well, I think this is the big question facing my profession, but obviously it faces us all at the moment.
Right.
You know, most clients I have, especially European clients, you know, most companies are trying to think and adjust. They're trying to think how they can adjust their company towards concerns of environment and social equality. And I think this is in some places superficial, but in other places I think it's very genuine. Mm-hmm. But there's certainly a shift, and you even find that within a political stratum. But I would say that in a sense, you know, my generation, as I explained before, you know, we were trained with to have social expectations of how we performed, and then we found ourselves in a period of consumerist expansion, and in a sense we became a service industry to consumerism. Let's put it as clearly as that. Mm-hmm. As everything has, in a way. I mean, you know, we're in a design fair, which is, let's be clear, it's about making objects to sell. There's nothing wrong. I mean, as you go back in history and trade and selling things, desirable things to each other is part of human civilization. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, I would say that within this last 30 years, that the commodification of architecture has detached it from other responsibilities. So in other words, our cities are no longer designed by planners, and they're not the consequence of one thing compared to another, or what one action might do within an urban environment or in the other environment is no longer considered. We accept that the free market has an intelligence of its own and an efficiency, which it does. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But to come to your point, we are now realizing that after 30 or 40 years of, as it were, undirected free market energy, we have made a few mistakes. And we are going to have to adjust to those mistakes. We can't beat ourselves up.
Right.
We can, but there's not much point about it. But we can certainly start thinking how we might adjust to that. Now that's, given that we're all in position, as it were, and in a position that we have developed over time, and we're, let's say, comfortable in that position, how do we discomfort ourselves in a comfortable way?
Right.
Because we're not going to get there without discomfort.
Right, yes. And without denying the validity and the quality of much of what has been done too, right? I mean,
Well, we have to learn.
Right, right.
And we have to critique, and we have to rethink, but we have to accept other challenges. I personally think this is an enormous, I'm very optimistic about it, because I think it gives us a collective responsibility. I think we all are now united with common responsibilities, which in the past you could say, very simply put, you could say we've been through a period of individualism where individual comfort has dominated over everything. And now we have to row back in a little bit and think about what is collective.
Yes, or at least shift the ratio somewhat,
yes.
I would say. Because in fact, obviously, a period of individualism has had at least some collective responsibility, but perhaps not enough. And a period in which there will be, we hope, more collective responsibility will not abandon all. I think it's more almost a matter of acknowledging that, you know, the way that a football game still needs referees on the field. The free market needs some forces that are willing to or are empowered to call foul at the key moments and to, you know, correct things and keep.
But that's
keep
where the
everybody
difficulty is. Who is the referee? And then what we have to now expect is that there is political engagement into this process, because you have to encourage. You can't just penalize.
Yes.
You have to encourage things to happen. So we're seeing with the green economy encouragements happening, which are friendly in a way. I mean, so, and I don't believe that people that are in the free market are against these issues. I mean, most developers that I know have similar ambitions that their project will contribute.
Yes.
They're not, I mean, of course, there are some investors, they're not in this room, but in other rooms that don't have that component to that in the mix. But I would say most people have ambitions for their project. And therefore, I think we have to encourage the criteria by which a project, in case of architecture, performs. So the question has to be now, what does this project do beyond its own economy? What does it do? What does it contribute to environment and community? What does it give back?
Yes.
And I think we have to ask every project, and that's not only architecture, that's what companies have to be doing, and companies are doing that. And that's
Right. Yeah, no, I think you put it very well then. I mean, in other words, we're not saying there's anything wrong with building for profit. In fact, we cannot have a society in which we do not do that. But at the same time, beyond bringing profit to investors, what else does it do for the broader social good? And those things should not be viewed as a zero-sum situation. but as things that are not mutually exclusive but can go together and reinforce each other.
It's more difficult to talk about a sort of interventionist approach in an American context, and
Yes.
probably in a Miami context more than any. But clearly,
See, I knew we'd come back to Miami.
we need intervention.
Yes.
I mean, it's a very simple example. In Britain, we have an enormous housing shortage.
Yes.
Enormous housing shortage. And we have people in transient housing, people that do not have permanent home,
Right.
in millions. I mean, I'm not talking about a small amount. In millions. Now, the leveraging of land value in cities has meant that most people can't afford to live in cities anymore.
Right.
But at the same time, the market is not, under its own terms, going to build very cheap housing.
Right.
Because there's no profit in you going to the bank and saying, I've got this brilliant business plan. I'm going to build the best housing for the lowest possible price. You know, the bank manager says, I think you've got your criteria the wrong way round. You know.
Yes.
But surely, if we're considerate of society, someone should be building
Right.
good housing at low prices. I'm sorry, you can't expect the market to volunteer, put their hands up to do that. So therefore, you have to stimulate them to do that. And who's going to stimulate that has to be the state,
Yes.
in one form or another.
That is exactly the problem we have here. I mean, we are dealing in this country with a parallel situation to what you describe in England. Just the numbers are even bigger, probably, and therefore the sheer volume of the crisis is larger still. Let me talk for a moment about another aspect of the, let's say, the social side of architecture and building, which is just public space and a sense of the public realm. Because I think that's probably, although I do not yet, and I don't think they're yet public, seeing the schemes you're developing in Miami. I presume that affordable housing is not a component of it, but that public space of some kind will be.
Yeah.
And can we talk about that a little bit and about the way in which today we often rely upon the private sector to contribute really to the presence of public space and collective space and social space?
Well, first of all, we have to rely on the
Right.
private sector. I mean, so going forward, what we have to see is a better relationship between the public sector, the administration, and the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
The private sector needs to be encouraged and supported in any gestures that they might do. They must be advantaged to giving away
Yes.
land in order that might have a problem. What we've realized, I mean, so let me also say, everything I talk about is full of hypocrisy. Because as an architect, I am deeply involved in projects which are about leveraging values, producing more things for the market. So, but we have to understand that where we are in terms of trying to adjust ourselves
Right.
from where we were to where we want to be is going to involve a huge amount of contradiction and hypocrisy. Because we can't go from one seat to another overnight.
Right.
But it shouldn't stop us defining and describing ambitions that we believe in.
Yes.
Or thoughts we.
Right.
I mean, so in the northwest of Spain, where we've been working for 7 or 8 years now with, we're working on the public realm,
Mm-hmm.
the space between everything.
Yes.
And we don't build as architects, but we agitate. So we go to ministers and say, why should this road happen here? Why does this happen? Why is the parking happening here?
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting because every mayor begins their description with what they're able to do, which is quite minimal.
Mm-hmm.
So they will define their frustration by the limitations they have.
Mm-hmm.
And our discussion with them always is, but that shouldn't, so we're coming in another way. So you're wrong, and we're wrong, because we're going to say, this is what should be.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to articulate what you want in order to move from what you have as the
Mm-hmm.
excuse. So there's a truth in there somewhere.
Yes.
But I think it's really important that we articulate, even if we can't get there, you have to be able to articulate what you would like to get to. And we've become so realistic, we've become so beaten up by realities.
Yes.
That we don't want to dream of things, or we don't want to imagine things, because especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, we become so realistic.
Yes.
You're just a dream. I've been told my whole life, yes, but you architects, you're unrealistic about these things. Yeah, actually, you have to have a little bit of unreality, because if you don't have it, then there's no motive to move away. Now, I think that the current crisis, environmental and social crisis, because we will not be able to cope with the discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, which is exaggerating at such a rate that it will, whether we feel morally or just practically, is going to, both of these things are going to hurt us.
They are already creating vast crevices in society, I think, now. Yes.
So I think the willingness there is, and we're certainly seeing it in the younger generation, to start to shift, to embrace this. And by the way, in terms of environment, it's not something you can start thinking about.
Right.
It's here. It's on our doorstep. It's not something we should start to think about this. We have to be. I'm not negative about that. I actually think it becomes a mandate to focus on things which actually most of us all believe in. I mean, would you prefer to have your food produced more locally?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, would you prefer to have cities where you can walk around and there's not so much traffic? Yeah.
Yes.
Would you like to have more parks and green space? Yeah. I mean, most of the stuff is sort of common sense.
Right.
But we don't have the mechanisms or the will to force those mechanisms, especially politically. But I think this gives us the tools and the mandate to put pressure. I mean, it's very difficult for a mayor now to say, I'm not interested in clean air. It's not my problem.
Right.
You won't find a mayor that won't say, of course.
Not if he or she wants to be reelected. Yes,
yeah, of course I'm interested in clean air. Will they do anything about it? Okay, that's another thing. But at least you've got them to the point that's important. Are they interested in housing? Yes. Okay, so what are you going to do about it? I think, are you interested in sustainability? Yes. Okay, so what does that really mean? And I think this gives us in the design community, and certainly the architectural planning community, leverage and responsibility to ask questions that in the past might not have been seen as real. These things now have a reality. And therefore it gives us dreamers, or people that are guilty of living outside of reality sometimes, it gives us a bit more leverage.
No, that's very good to hear. I mean, what I hear you saying is that on every level, architecture needs to be more aspirational. Let's say that, and maybe that's a way of answering the question I posed much earlier in our conversation, which is, what can the architect actually do to bring the client along a little bit, and perhaps just helping the client believe more in the aspirations of the project and focus more on aspirational aspects of it, while not denying the realities that we all live with. and must live with?
Well, public clients
Yeah.
Are easier.
I've never heard any. You sure you want to go on record as saying public clients are easy?
In this context.
Oh, in this context.
Because you can blackmail them.
Okay.
Because we're working for the London School of Economics. You can say to the London School of Economics, I'm sorry, you cannot do a project which is not confronting issues of sustainability.
Sure.
In 5 years' time, when this project's built, you're going to be extremely embarrassed if you haven't demonstrated that you've engaged responsibilities as the London School of Economics. I mean, okay, that's a particular thing.
Yes.
So you can blackmail them, and because it's part of their social responsibility. It's not part of a developer's social responsibility, naturally. However, I think that so many of the things we're talking about are common sense. So in terms of the energetic performance of buildings, we've been going that way for a long time. I mean, what's the point of making buildings that don't perform well climatically? What's the point of not taking the consideration that a south-facing plate glass window is going to cause you to... Now, in a land where energy has never been particularly problematic, or it's been cheap, there's been a less anxiety about addressing that. But I think now it's much more embedded within the whole industry that why not make buildings perform intelligently in terms of energy out and energy in, keeping as much sun out, the energy you don't want to come in, out, and the energy you want to keep in, out, in. So we've understood that, and that actually it makes even financial sense.
Quite a
just
bit of
needs
financial
a bit more
sense,
design consideration though. However, where we are now, which is to do with the use of materials and their embedded CO2, is a much more complicated thing to grapple and much more difficult to measure and to inherit, because it does put you into quite complicated things about not being able to use material from there because you've got to transport it. We shouldn't be using glass from China. We shouldn't be bringing material from that. So these things are a bit more difficult to take. But again, what we're seeing in Europe is an enormous encouragement to the private sector to adopt these responsibilities. But you can't expect the private sector to adopt them without any support or encouragement. And now what we're seeing is, certainly in a European context, these things are being taken very seriously. I don't know about America. I don't think as much, but I think there is a shift.
I think there's absolutely a shift in America. I think it is not as broad as the shift in Europe, let's say. Not as complete, but very much so. I mean, I think certain, nobody's built a curtain wall with south-facing glass without taking certain precautions for some time. I mean, a certain degree of attention to these things, I think, has become now as expected as, let's say, electricity and plumbing in a building. But as I think you've also suggested, that in itself is not quite enough. I mean, there's also issues of carbon, issues of other, of transport. But of course, that supports the whole notion of also local economies and local things, as you said earlier in a reference to food. Local is often better in many ways.
Yeah, and the decisions which are made in the way we build our world, because I don't think we can really, hand on heart, look back at the last 40 years and think this particular period has been glorious in terms of the way that we have built cities, or what we've done to our towns, or what we've done. So, why? And why has that happened? And I think it's to do with lack of planning, and therefore, the problem has been, and I think this is a sort of perfect storm of issues, that we have shifted from an overall idea to singular ideas. Mm-hmm. So as architects, what we do now is the package. You know, we are responsible for making the object.
Yeah.
But we are not involved in anything further upstream. Mm-hmm. So now, for instance, you might be involved in a project where you're looking at the issue of sustainability from the point of view of the building, but you might actually realize that the most sustainable thing was not to have built there at all, but it would have been better to build in the city next to public transportation.
Yes.
Now, so who is going to make that decision? Planners. It has to be, you know, so if we really want to deal with sustainability, we have to go further upstream. You can't do it just with clever window frames or,
right.
you know, using timber on your structure. Right. So it has to, we're going to have to make bigger decisions. So we need buy-in from bigger structures, from administrations. We need to think about that in a different way. And I think that's the difficult challenge.
Well, it's a difficult challenge in part because it implies some degree of limitation of the individual freedom that our very market-driven society so values. And that we all value, but we seem to value it too often without limits rather than with limits.
I want to drop in a bit of provocation here
as
well about
please.
the role of design, because we're in a design fair here, in terms of where I believe the profession of architecture's got to. Mm-hmm. That as we become less socially relevant, we've actually compensated for that by the vividness and the imagery of architecture itself. In other words, I would argue, and a lot of people would deny this, but I would argue that we have somehow distracted ourselves by creating buildings which themselves are fascinating and innovative and novel, because in a way they have to perform something. They have to, in a way, sell themselves.
And we really look at them sometimes as entertainment, almost, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm exaggerating, but I do think what we're going to find in the next years is a sort of movement towards a slightly more, what I might call a more intelligent architecture, an architecture that's evolved through process more than a sort of product-obsessed position. We have, as architects, been subjected in a way to expectations about what does architecture look like. Mm-hmm. You know, it's always about what it looks like. And if you think about the buildings that you really like from history, some of them don't look like much, but they're just beautiful to be in.
Yeah.
But that's a very difficult thing to sell. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult with computer-generated images that we have to give nowadays. In terms of a design discussion early on in a project or in a competition, to say, don't worry about what it looks like, it's going to be really nice. It's going to be such a nice place to be. That's quite difficult to sell.
Yeah.
You can't sell the physical, experiential qualities of architecture, which in the end are the ones that matter. It's much easier to sell a poster and say, it's going to look like this. And everyone says, oh, wow, that's great. So it's pushed us towards a visual judgment of architecture instead of an experiential one. And I think that will move, if for no other reason, that every time you do something a little bit stupid in buildings, in terms of shapeism and cantilever, you are going against intelligent, sustainable, it's energy consuming. So when you have a sustainability budget on a project, it's very tight. Mm-hmm. You can't waste that sustainability budget on useless gestures.
Mm-hmm.
So we're doing a few projects where we are really hitting very, very, very tight sustainability targets. And you are evaluating everything out of intelligence. You know, every time you shift a column off of grid, you're wasting, you're using your budget. Not just your financial budget, but your...
Right. No, I get it. But let me ask you this. Doesn't that useless gesture sometimes create a degree of delight? I mean, let's go back to commodity, firmness, and delight for a moment. We'll go back to Vitruvius. There's no argument on the commodity and no argument on the firmness.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's nice to have a bit of delight, no?
Yeah, and the great danger with a lot of what I'm saying is why I say there's enormous hypocrisy here as well. That if you're not careful, you just start describing the profession as being a combination of environmentalists, sociologists, politicians. You say, well, and where's architecture in all of that?
Right.
So are we just jumping off the boat and saying what it looks like, it doesn't matter? Of course not. I'm just saying, I think that the judgments that we make, where we might find beauty, will change.
Yes, okay.
And I think that there will be a shift, in a sense, away from what might be seen as being unnecessary gestures towards something, a beauty which is slightly more based on process and the application of...
Well, in a way, I was going to bring us back to the question of form a little bit and ask you to talk about your work from that standpoint for a moment. But I think in a way you've already been doing it, because one thing that's always struck me about your work is that it is, it's not flashy in the way that a lot of work is. It seems to be consistently dignified, modern, understated, but quietly self-assured in a very beautiful way. In other words, I remember long ago once finding a wonderful book in the library from the 1920s that was called Good Manners in Architecture. And your work has always, it seemed to me, had the goal of showing that a building can be clearly modern, not historicizing, but represent both a comfortable relationship with something older and show that modernism could itself be extremely well-mannered. Is that a fair, knowing that's a wild generalization, of course, too, but is it a fair one?
Well, I probably tried to find a way of turning a lack of imagination into a sort of architectural position.
I think you're being a little harsh on yourself to speak of lack of imagination. I don't think the Pritzker is awarded for lack of imagination, generally.
Well, I think that I've always wanted... Okay, there's a confusion between architecture as are we artists? There's been an attitude a little bit in the last 30 or 40 years that we are artists. There's a lot of architects who look at that, and I feel very strongly that we're not. And the reason is that I think artists have a responsibility to be provocative. They have a responsibility to discomfort us and ask questions that we don't know how to ask in other ways. Or architecture is not a medium of discomfort or challenge. If you go into your living room, you don't want to be challenged every time. You just want to sit down, have a nice cup of coffee, and look out of the window. You don't want every time to say, "Oh, I'm really challenged by this building." I don't get it, really. I think architecture is an affirmative thing. It should be reaffirming the things that we enjoy in our daily lives. Just, getting up in the morning, being in a nice space, having nice light, having a nice floor, living in a good street. I mean, it's an affirmative process. So I think I would justify my lack of imagination in the sense of trying to hold very tight to what I think I believe in. I don't really want to go, I'm not very comfortable at going too far away from what I feel secure about. So that is a little bit of lack of imagination, and it's a very different approach to architecture from architects who believe that it's our responsibility to, as it were, innovate. And this is a remnant of the 20th century, heroic architecture of the 1920s onwards, which encouraged architects to believe that a new society needed a new architecture. And they were sort of true, and it's difficult not to be extremely excited by so much of that work.
Yes, and it brought us some extraordinary and truly great buildings and some truly horrible cities, to go back to your earlier point. I mean, it had an ability to create great individual works of art and somehow a complete loss of belief in the larger goal of the civilized city, I guess we could say. Yeah.
And I think we are now starting to understand that our cities can't just be made out of single buildings.
Right.
Because in the end, that's not what you live in. You live in, so, it's there's a very nice thing in Spain. They say, we go to the street. Let's go to the street.
Yes.
That means, let's go and see people. It doesn't mean let's go and look at the street, I mean the pavement or the asphalt, or cars. It means we have two worlds, our private world and the world of the street, in a way. The street being us, commonality. So the issue about the public realm is not just that we should be making occasional moments of urban relief, but that we should be shaping cities for common enjoyment. Now, the weird thing is, I suspect most of us would come to quite an agreement, as we did earlier on about, traffic and about what sort of city we would like to be. What do we think? I think I could get quite a reasonable consensus about what makes a nice city.
Yes.
I'm not sure I could get the same about architecture.
I agree.
But I could get it about cities. And yet, you show me anything that we've built in the last 30 years that is anywhere close to those ambitions. So what a weird idea that we all know what a city should be and we don't build it.
Right.
Because there's a lot of things where we don't know what it should be and we have an excuse not to give the answer because we don't know what the answer is. But we know what makes a reasonably good city. So why don't we make them?
Do you think some of it is scale?
Yeah, it's all scale.
It's all scale. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That was easy. Because we make too many things that are too big?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a very interesting moment in COVID, or because of COVID, not moment, but I think COVID had an interesting, there was an opportunity for us to rethink scale. And rethink local and rethink close. We realized that staying with our family in our town or in our street, all of a sudden there's quite a lot of attractions in that. We never had the time to really think about that. If you extrapolate that into a sort of idea of localism, you get into a very dangerous territory because we have, quite rightly, for the last 50 years or so, believed in free trade, in fluidity of movement of people, of trading. Free trade means that there should be anything to protect. I should be able to sell carrots to you under the price of a local carrot because I don't know. If you put barriers into that,
Right.
there's something a bit strange about that. However, because of COVID, we started to realize again that there might need to be interventions that start to think about prioritizing some view of local in comparison to the monopoly that globalism has had for the last 50 years or so. It's very difficult to speak against globalism. And you could argue in the past that if you did speak against it, that was protectionism.
It was a Brexit kind of position.
Yeah.
Yes, right,
So,
right.
and that's
right.
intellectually it's wrong. And
Right.
However, I do think again that sustainability will give us legitimate reasons to promote things which happen more locally. Just moving, I mean, coming from the hotel here, it took us like 45 minutes.
I know, me too.
To move
Yes,
from one end of a town to another.
Right.
It's sort of crazy that you end up sort of seeing the city as something
I know.
negative.
I was thinking, yes. I mean, the fact that one sees Miami and Miami Beach primarily through the window of an Uber rather than on foot or in transit is, shows you the whole problem in a way. But doesn't this run head on into the challenge of the urgent need for more housing, say? I mean, how do we maintain smaller scale, protect the natural resources of land, and house millions more people? You don't have to answer that right now. I mean, I mean that almost rhetorically, because I don't think anybody really has the answer to that.
Well, I think through intelligent planning we can use our land in a better way.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt. We're building on much too much green land, and we're not
Yes.
using the right densities. We know that we need fairly dense urban development. I don't think we necessarily have to change that. But certainly what we're seeing in London is that the land values are so high that buildings are being built not because they make the city better, but because they generate
So much money that nobody can not do it. Right. If they
and then none of us can afford to live there.
Right. No, that is certainly
it's a strange
the case.
way of building a city.
That is the case in New York. It's the case in Miami. It's the case in a lot of places that have had both the blessing and the curse of prosperity, I guess you should say. But
and it's not to say that we're all part of this ecology, and I think we just have to sort of work out the good bits and the bad bits. But I think at this point, it's incumbent on us to start identifying responsibilities that we might need or have to embrace and include into our process.
that is a great final note, I think, and there's so much more we could be saying, including talking about some of your other work, which we've barely touched on today at all. But we're almost at our point of adjournment, and I did want to leave time if there are a couple of questions from the floor to give an opportunity for a couple of you. Yes, you and then you. And the mic, let's start there and then there. Thank you.
Hi, David. I wonder if you can speak to, you already did to some degree, about the rapid development of architecture around the world by a couple of firms like Big and Foster, and how quickly they produce work, and how it doesn't seem like it can really represent where they are building. It doesn't really speak to the environment, or an environment that's trying to be created in an urban setting. So those firms are creating, it seems like, monumental pieces almost every week. And it doesn't seem like that can really reflect the fabric of the city where they're being built. So what do you think about architecture being produced that quickly?
I'm not sure we can really finger, a few firms as being the responsibles for, what's happening in development. And I think if you sort of travel around the country, I mean, what Norman Foster's office might do is pretty small in terms of the volume. But I would say that clearly architects that have profile have a certain responsibility to demonstrate those responsibilities. And I would say, certainly, I don't know much about Big, but I know Foster's office, and I know that they certainly have embraced issues of sustainability. They're certainly taking those issues very, very seriously. I know Norman is very much. But I would, again, say that we have to accept that there's hypocrisy involved in our current position, because we are in a very, very fast period having to mutate from one position to another. And the paradox, I think, amongst architects, for instance, is that if you're going to look at established architects, is that the ones that probably can have most voice and most authority are probably the ones that most embedded in the current condition. The ones that are not, have much more freedom to challenge, are younger architects who probably don't have much voice or authority. Right. So there is a responsibility at the moment, I think, for those of us at a different point in our careers and a more privileged point in our careers to try to help open some pathways or show examples or to encourage a younger generation to really go in a different direction. But we're always going to need large infrastructural projects. We're not going to go back to the caves. We're going to need railways. We're going to need railway stations. We're probably going to need airports. So an office like Norman Foster's is, I would prefer they to be doing large infrastructural projects than most people, because they have a very high level of proficiency and effectiveness, and I think they are also trying to take on board, challenges which are now we have to take on board.
Thank you, David. Let's do one final one there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a student in architecture school right now. So I guess my question would be, what's something that you wish you knew when you were in school?
I'm sorry, I can't hear very well.
What's something you wish you knew when you were in architecture school? I'm a student right now.
What was the main inspiration?
Something that inspired
What's something you wish you knew when you were in school?
Wish you knew. Something you wish you had known when you were in architecture school.
Gosh. That's a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
I think ignorance is quite useful, actually. I think if you knew what you were going to get half the time, you wouldn't get out of bed. So, I think the difficulty for architects, if you're at architecture school, is, what you're going to have to get used to is there's no clear path. What does it mean to be an architect? It's not like you're going to then, so to some degree, you have to define that path yourself. You're going to have to find it. And I think for your generation, I think that path is going to be even more complicated in some ways in terms of professional chances. I would say in another way, I think you're much more, potentially you've got much more purpose. I personally believe that architects are very well trained to think about consequential issues. One of the things about planning that we've realized, and certainly Galicia where we're working, is that there's no connection between traffic planning, urban planning, environmental protection. They're all in pockets. I have no real interest in traffic planning, but I've spent the last 5 years, working on road systems. I have no interest in road systems, but I'm interested in the quality of towns and villages. And you can't actually address the quality of towns and villages without dealing with the traffic, because actually in northern Spain, that's what's screwing up every town is traffic. So we find ourselves as architects understanding the connection between one decision and another. And actually, I would say that we're quite motivated because we know what the final reward is, which is, there is, when it's not just a sort of, it's not a reward system. I mean, our reward is to try to create beautiful things. So I found, for instance, in our foundation in Galicia, we are so much more effective than any other politician because we're driven by something we want to achieve, which is to protect the environment, to create better public spaces, to create better towns and villages. When I speak to politicians, I'm really surprised how little focus they have. You have to forgive them because they've got huge responsibilities in other areas. But we have a very nice focus in a way that, we can concentrate on, which is we believe that the way we build, where we build, how we build, who we build for, can make the world a better place. That's a great mission to have. What path you take to that, but again, I would say that mission is clearer now, I would say, than it has been for a long time. The mandate to follow that mission is clearer now than it has been. The urgency to follow that mission is clearer now than it has been for a long time. And I think that puts you as a young architect in a good place. What path you find there is difficult. That's really, but I think if you can see where those paths lead, then I think that's very powerful.
And I think I'd rather ride on a road designed by you than a traffic engineer anyway. So, thank you. Anyway, please join me in thanking David Chipperfield for an extraordinary hour.